I'd like to say welcome to everybody. It's a real pleasure to have Eleanor back with us. She was speaking to us a year ago on Swedenborg in India, a talk I think we all very much enjoyed. And she mentioned a
Mhm.
couple of topics she might speak about, which sort of piqued our interest. And this is one of them, talking about internal breathing, which we're very much looking forward to. So, look, without further ado, I'll say thanks for coming and speaking to us again, Eleanor. I look forward to everything that you've got to say.
Awesome. Well, let's get going. All right. So this is a talk that I could make into a 3-hour lecture, or a hour and a half lecture, or a 45-minute lecture. So if you guys have questions, feel free to put them in the chat because I am doing a little bit of a sped up version of this. So this is both a Swedenborg talk and a yoga talk, and it is a neuroscience talk. So we're going to be kind of touching on all of those subjects. And as it is a yoga talk, I want to start by kind of invoking Ganesha and by invoking the spirit that removes blockages, removes obstacles. And because of course Ganesha, having the head of an elephant and the body of a man, represents this connection between the natural world and the spiritual world, which is what we're talking about today. And how do you access that, and how do you understand where that connection is happening in your body? And so to control the mind is to control time. And to control time is to control prana, is to control energy in the nadis, in the rivers, in the streams, through yogic method, through spiritual practice. Prana, energy, is the tie rope of the mind. And as such, pranayama, breath control, is wisdom. So this is my talk on internal breathing. It's a talk that I have given a couple of times, and I have a couple different versions of it. If you are interested in this subject beyond the scope of this lecture, because it is a very complicated subject, like I said, please scan this QR code, because that will take you to my paper on the subject that I published a few years ago, and it goes a lot deeper than what I'm going to be able to talk about today. And I can go back to this if anyone wants it at the end. But this is me. I have an MFA in fine art and an MA in the history of Swedenborgianism. I do many things. I'm, I'm practicing yogi and artist, and I do lectures like this. This is one of my favorite things to do. So thank you so much for having me here. So, like I said, this talk is pretty far-ranging, but there are 3 central kind of points that are the main takeaways that I want you guys to focus on and keep in mind. First of all, we're going to talk about what is this idea of internal breathing. Drawing from a couple different quotes from a couple different parts of Swedenborg's writings, and then we're going to talk about what does contemporary neuroscience say about breath, and how does that kind of line up with what Swedenborg says. And then I want to introduce you to this idea that the idea of internal breathing and internal perception more broadly can be used as a meditative force, kind of a contemplative force, an introspective force, but I think it's the most powerful when it's used as an artistic force, as a creative force. So we're going to look at some other artists and some of what I've done in my own creative process to engage this way of thinking. All right, here we go. Oh, Yeah, but emphasis animations, which I forgot about. So this is a animation that I made a couple of years ago, which is directly related to a place in the Arcana where Swedenborg describes a particular kind of internal breathing. And there are lots of different kinds of internal breathing. It's not all the same thing. But this is one where the primary kind of motion of energy is moving between the brain, the lungs, the heart, and the kidneys. And so I really wanted to visualize that, because a lot of the things that we're going to be talking about are going to be talking about this kind of internal subtle energy, interoception, and you know, that word in that opening quote, nadis, means literally, it means streams in Sanskrit. And you know, when Swedenborg talks about this stuff, he's going to be talking about flow, flux, current, streams. So it's all of this idea that consciousness moves in a way similar to water, or electricity. So internal breathing is breathing with your nervous system first, is breathing consciousness first, before your lungs. So there's internal breathing and external breathing. And external breathing focuses on the lungs and focuses on the type of breathing that we do when we speak. Internal breathing focuses on the nervous system. So the main shift is not necessarily holding your breath for a long time. It's more shifting the awareness of what part of your body do you lead your breath with. So it's breathing in a way that allows us to have perception of the interior parts of our minds by the vehicle of the external senses. And, you know, so connecting the external sensors to an inner higher perception of reality. Swedenborg thought that this was how ancient people breathed before we had spoken language. So as humans evolve, as humans become more dependent on the spoken word, we become mentally externalized. Swedenborg himself used it to put himself into these kinds of trance states, which he would then use to go and speak with spirits. We can use it for meditation and creativity. And I really want to emphasize this point that's being covered with my voice to text, but all experiences can be spiritual. This experience that we're having right now is a spiritual experience. So when we talk about, you know, opening up the interior parts of the mind, or the Lord opening up interior parts of the mind for us, we are not talking about something unnatural. We're talking about a very, very natural, intentional process that's as natural as a flower opening. So he says in the spiritual diary, for many years, from early childhood, I have been introduced to such internal breathing, most of all during intense moments of insight, when breathing comes to rest, and if it does not, an intense insight of truth is not given. So he has these experiences all throughout childhood, and then in the 1740s, 30s and 40s, he starts studying the brain. He starts studying neuroanatomy. And he is thinking about how breath and the nervous system act together, how they integrate, and what does this have to do with consciousness? What does this have to do with the soul? And so he puts forth this beautiful treatise on the brain, which is right here. And it's thick. This was one of the first really comprehensive functional neuroanatomy books, because there had been neuroanatomists, but it was only very recently in history that they actually had the ability to extract a brain from a skull without destroying all of the kind of internal structures. And then this guy named Thomas Willis, who's a Brit, gets wait, if we go back to this one, this image is an engraving by an artist named Thomas Willis, and he's where we get the arc of Willis from, which is this kind of circular structure in the vasculature at the bottom of the brain. So none of this stuff had been really, nobody was really aware of it because they didn't have the technology to kind of dissect that anatomy. And so what happens is Swedenborg gets his hands on this and starts coming to conclusions about how this anatomy actually works. And it should be said, this is pre any knowledge, this is pre-cell theory, this is pre-electrical theory, this is pre-Galvani, this is pre, all of the big names in kind of early neuroscience. He's before all of them. So basically what Swedenborg has is a very, very primitive microscope. And he's looking at the brain and he's just intuitively, how does this system work? And so he comes at it like an engineer. And he comes at it like an engineer who doesn't have any idea about cells, who doesn't have any idea about neurotransmitters, about a neuron. So he uses other words. He uses words like spirals, fibers, spiritus fluids, and creates this kind of vocabulary for all of these very small microscopic structures in the brain that how he interprets them. So it's not the same as contemporary neuroscience, and that should be said, but just look at how he's intuiting it and then how he uses these ideas that he intuits. This passage is from where he's describing the brain, and he's describing the brain in terms of kind of levels of complexity. And so nature is doing all of these things, and nature makes anatomical kind of levels in purer and purer substances, according to Swedenborg. This is how neuroanatomy and science in general was thought of during the 18th century. So nor does nature seem to rest here. On the other hand, she goes further from, in degrees of refinement. A substance still purer and of more perfect form being in turn the cortex of the spiral. So he's describing how he thinks of these microscopic structures without a microscope. In other words, nature germinates numerous more subtle spirals within these, containing relatively larger spirals, for she always aspires to her ultimate substances, where she is most potent in forces. And wherever there is an opening, she skillfully prepares for herself a way in order that from these substances, as from centers, she may be able to act into all the other parts as peripheries. In the case of these spirals, this is a couple numbers later, therefore, there seem to exist 4 distinct degrees of composition. This is going to come back important, this 4 degrees idea. The first degree, and that which our sight cannot discover, even when its keenness is furnished with glasses, has been already spoken of. The second is recognized even by the naked eye and in the spirals of the cerebrum. The third makes up, as it were, the tori and distinguishes them by winding passages and furrows. The fourth, which is the whole mass of the later substance, is the encephalon of the brain, properly so called. So he thinks of the brain and the body in terms of these 4 distinct degrees. What does this have to do with internal breathing? Well, he goes from the first part of the treatise of the brain is neuroanatomy, and it's a lot of stuff that's drawn from his contemporary neuroanatomists. Then later he gets into this text, and this text is a neuropathology book, and in it, it's kind of like the first version of like the DSM, where he goes through different mental conditions and neurological conditions and gives very detailed descriptions of what he thinks is causing them. And, you know, there's spiritus fluids, but it's also things like density and motion of the brain, and the way we breathe, which comes up over and over again. And one of the last essays that he writes in this neuropathology text, this morbi cerebri, the diseases of the brain, one of the last things that he writes, and this is just to kind of put you in the timeline of where this is happening, this is around 1741. He has his spiritual awakening in 1745. So over these few years where he goes into a state of real crisis, he is actively studying the brain. He's actively studying consciousness. And he kind of discovers that there are ways to use breath to hack consciousness, you know, for lack of a better word, to open up levels of consciousness that are not available to the mundane practitioner. So this is from the Codex 55 on the brain, and he is talking about ecstasy. He says that I suspect that an alternate cause of ecstasy is the inhibition or suffocation of the respiration of the lungs, while the pulsation of the heart and the arteries and the movement of the cerebrum and the cerebellum, medulla oblongata, and the spinal cord survives. This movement perfectly coincides with an alternating motion of the heart, from which a change arises in the state of the whole system. Everything corporeal shrinks and wavers, nor does it dare to rise up against the animating force, which then acts and governs absolutely. Blood then does not excite the muscle, the blood vessels, the auricles or ventricles of the heart. It only excites the nerve fibers from the head, the spirit which acts at alternate times with the blood. As the body is no longer left to its own jurisdiction, it falls into an ecstatic swoon. The animate force, liberated from the bridles and prisons of flesh, exists for itself and its own intuition in its own spirit. All alone, the body seems far away, and it becomes vegetative, or it adopts a fetal or embryonic vitality. Immutability of this state exists only with those with whom the foramen ovale is open, or with whom it has been unlocked. When the lungs collapse, and therefore the passage into the pulmonary artery is denied without passage for the blood through the foramen ovale or the coronary vesicles, the precordia are necessarily burst, and the ecstatic person dies. So Swedenborg just develops this deep interest in near-death experiences. And for some reason, a lot of people think that like Raymond Moody was the first person to observe this. But here we have a very clear description of that there is, you know, back in the 18th century, there was medical precedent for understanding that you know, he's not talking about this as if it's, you know, something that just happened to me. He's talking about this as if this is something that regularly happens to people. And if you read the rest of this essay, it's even more clear that this is something that is known to happen. And so he gets fascinated with it, and he puts, you know, this hypothesis that that there's something to do with this foramen ovale, which is a fetal shunt in the heart. And the foramen ovale, when you're prevented from breathing, the foramen ovale opens, and this causes blood to get shifted away from the lungs and into the brain. And this increase in blood flow to the brain, he thought, was what caused these ecstatic near-death states. So, of course, as a scientist, he starts experimenting with this stuff. He starts practicing it. He starts doing death meditation, and it works. And that's, the rest of the story is that he was able to get himself into these ecstatic near-death trance states. And this is how he did it. Like he tells us. So from further on in the spiritual diary, he says, at this point, several species of respiration were shown to me, about which I also spoke quite a lot. That there is an external kind with the normal breathing, which is the one common to the world of spirits. Then an inner one together with an imperceptible outer one, this being quite good. Then there is an inner one without any others, which is better. And then there is also an imperceptible one, almost none of which I could perceive, and which is angelic. These are the types of respiration. So again, we have this division into kind of 4 layers of subtlety, 4 degrees of complexity that you have to go through in order to move from the mundane consciousness into this spiritually awakened consciousness. And this stuff, it continues into the theological writings. So the human being breathes outwardly and he breathes inwardly. Outwardly, he draws breath from the world, but inwardly from heaven. When a person dies, he ceases to breathe outwardly, but his inward breathing, which is soundless and undetectable by him while he lives in the world, continues. This breathing is regulated altogether by his affection for truth, and that's by the life of his faith. I find that last line really interesting. And, because it's really easy to kind of gatekeep spiritual experiences. Like, there are some people who get to have them. There are some people who, are the privileged, are the prophets, are, people we hold up as mystics. And then there's everyone else, and it's kind of like, oh, I could never have a spiritual experience. A lot of people, get to come to me with that kind of attitude, or I'm too humble to have, I would never think to lift myself up onto the pillar of prophecy and proclaim myself. That's not what I'm talking about. This is not a question of arrogance or being special. This is a question that you as a living being have a prerogative to understand yourself. It is a matter of hygiene, and we don't think of ourselves as glorious for taking a shower, and yet we feel afraid of our internal state, but we are also responsible for our internal state, because our internal state dictates the affection for truth, and that's the life of his faith. That life of faith is something that we are all expected to live as spiritual citizens. And so don't be afraid of it. So there's this kind of 4-stage shift from the, physical breathing to angelic breathing. The external, normal kind of breathing that we use when we speak. It involves a strong motion of the lungs and sustains normal consciousness. The imperceptible external plus internal. In this stage, the external breath becomes suppressed but not suspended. As was explained in the story in the essay on ecstasy, an inhibition of the lungs will allow us to become aware of the motion of the beating of the heart and the breathing of the brain and the nervous system. The soul becomes raised up into a sphere of intense pleasure. And then the internal breath, where the external breath becomes wholly suspended and awareness turns inward towards the gentle oscillations of spiritual energy in the heart, the spine, and the brain. the pleasure becomes bliss. This is called kumbhakonam in yoga. And then there is the angelic breathing. And finally, abandoning this physical respiration altogether, we become aware that it was never us breathing, and that there was never us breathing at all, but that our breath is the breath of myriads of living minds, all belonging to the unified consciousness of love and wisdom. This is also from the Arcana. I have been shown by actually observing it how the internal breathing of the most ancient people flowed in a non-audible manner into a kind of external and thus non-verbal speech, which was perceived by another person in his interior man, his interior person. They said that the breathing with them changed according to their state of love and faith in the Lord. They also stated the reason, namely that because they had communication with heaven, it could not be otherwise. In fact, they and the angels who accompanied them were breathing in unison. Angels have breathing in which the internal breathing corresponds, and which with them changes in a similar way. Indeed, when they encounter everything contrary to love and faith in the Lord, their breathing is labored. But when they are experiencing the happiness that accompanies love and faith, their breathing is full and free. Something similar to this also exists with every human being, but in this case, everything depends on the bodily and worldly loves and on a person's basic assumptions. When anything goes against these, they experience labored breathing. But when it is in keeping with them, his breathing is full and free. These observations, however, apply to external breathing. And we all know this. We all know this intuitively, that this is the case. Our breathing corresponds to our emotional state. You know, the only thing revolutionary that he's saying is that our breathing corresponds to our emotional state, which corresponds to our neurological state, which corresponds to our collectivized spiritual state, because that's this unified breathing that he's talking about, that everyone in a society breathes together. And that's so cool, but this is not the only place that he talks about it. This is a recurring theme in the writings, is these kind of fractal shifting collectives of, you know, spiritual entities that all unify themselves via the harmony of their breath. So there we go. By experiencing inner breathing. What's that?
Eleanor, what does he mean by non-verbal speech?
I'm not sure whether he's talking like literal telepathy.
Right.
But
I come from a Pentecostal background, and I'm seeing with ecstatic and things like that. I'm seeing kind of connections almost with the gift of tongues here. I don't know whether that's a real thing or not.
It's not something that Swedenborg ever directly addresses, but what he does say about this nonverbal speech thing is that other places where he's describing people of the most ancient church, he talks about them communicating with facial expressions. So I think that's what he's referring to, that they could have whole conversations just looking at each other's faces, that it's more visual, and more expressive and subtle. But I don't know. It's kind of a vague statement.
Thanks.
Yeah. So the pituitary gland is right here, and Swedenborg talks a lot about the pituitary gland. He has an entire treatise on it. And some of you may have heard that Swedenborg discovered the pituitary gland. This is something that is said a lot. And when people hear that, I think sometimes people think that he discovered that the pituitary gland has an association with growth hormone and development, because that's what most modern people think that it does. But he actually discovered something else about it, which I think is a little bit more interesting. So looking at the anatomy of the pituitary gland, Swedenborg intuited a connection between the way we breathe and the way our brains work and develop. The pituitary gland connects to the rest of the brain through the thalamus and the thalamocortical fibers. So this is praised as one of his greatest spiritual discoveries, but it also has kind of a spiritual aspect. And I wanted to give you this GIF of a person. Fun fact, this person is speaking German. Interesting. But what I wanted to show is that as we're speaking, the brain actually moves quite a bit. And this is what Swedenborg kind of discovered, is he was looking at, so step back, before Swedenborg, the main kind of authority on how the brain works was René Descartes. And René Descartes did not think that the cerebrum did anything. He thought it was just kind of dead mush, because he didn't have the technology to actually, extract it so that he couldn't see the anatomy. But Descartes thought that the seat of the soul was the pituitary gland. And we should mention at this point that there were two different concepts of what the soul was in Sweden during Swedenborg's time. There was this kind of imported idea that comes from the French, that's a more kind of classical idea, of the soul, S-J-O-L, Schuele, which was very particularized, which was that, so Descartes takes the brain and he basically puts a spiral on top of the brain. And he says, wherever the center of that spiral is, that must be the seat of the soul. And the center of the back of the skull is the pineal gland. And this is where, ever since, we get this discourse in esotericism about the pineal gland, and decalcify your pineal gland, all of this stuff is all Cartesian. What happens with Swedenborg is he starts taking apart brains, looking at this anatomy, again, with much better technology. And he says, actually, the pineal gland is only really attached to the visual systems. It's not attached to the whole brain. So if, according to Swedenborg, the whole brain is important, it must be something else. So Swedenborg brings in this indigenous Nordic concept of the soul called the hug. And the hug is different because the hug is a more distributed idea of the soul. It's the idea that the soul is also comes from your environment, that the soul is more of a holistic thing, that the soul can be, a more distributed, almost non-local phenomenon. And so when we're talking about Swedenborg's search for the soul and Swedenborg's idea of the soul, we really need to have this concept that there are two different warring ideas of what the soul is. And Swedenborg very much makes the indigenous Nordic concept, he makes that argument. So in moving from the pineal gland to the pituitary gland, Swedenborg is moving from a concept of the soul that's this very divided kind of Cartesian universe that only has one point of contact between the natural and the spiritual, to a very different kind of metaphysics where every point within kind of the field of reality can exist according to this spiraling field structure. And therefore, the natural and the spiritual can be unified over a field. So it's kind of like moving from standard physics, like old-fashioned physics, to quantum physics. It's a very similar shift. You could even say this is, proto-Schrödingerian, to be bold. And it all centers around, how does he conceive the brain? How does he conceive the nervous system? And this idea that the pituitary gland, not the pineal gland, is the seat of the soul. Why? Because when we breathe, the pituitary gland moves. And not just the pituitary gland, but this whole part of the upper part of the sinuses moves as we breathe and as we speak. So the input, so the connector between the spiritual world and the natural world is breath. So what does contemporary neuroscience say about this? Because if he's right, there should be some kind of evidence that we can find with modern research methods. All right, so what's the connection between breathing and cognition? Dr. Christina Zelano, the assistant professor of neurology at Northwestern University, Feinberg School of Medicine in Chicago, Illinois, says, when you breathe in, we discovered, you are stimulating neurons in the olfactory cortex. That's the olfactory means smell, so that's the part right above your nose. The amygdala, which is the part of your brain that feels fear, very interesting. It's also the root of your temporal lobes. And the hippocampus, which is right next to your amygdala, also the root of your temporal lobe, but the hippocampus has to do with memory. So we have olfactory cortex, that's our emotional brain. We have the amygdala, that's our fear-based brain. And we have our hippocampus, that's our memory, our intellectual brain. All across the limbic system, which is the internal part of your brain, which is your core emotional state, instinct and mood. When you inhale through your nose, you are, in a sense, synchronizing brain oscillations across the limbic network. So they did this study, and these were people who were epileptics, who had some other measurement devices put into their brain. And so the scientists were like, hey, while we're in there, can we put a couple extra nodes in? So these are in-brain measurements. This isn't like someone sitting with the cap on their head. This is actual in-brain measurements. So you can measure very specifically from different parts of the neuroanatomy. And this is a very simple experiment. They had them, see, this is labeled nose, this is labeled mouth. They had them breathe through their mouth. They had them breathe through their nose. And they took all the data and they averaged it. And what do we see? Well, we see that when you breathe through your nose, in all of these three parts of the brain that they're talking about, you get a spike. And whenever those neurons, there's a term, neurons that fire together wire together. So you're actively training these parts of your brain that have to do with emotional regulation, mood, memory, and anxiety when you breathe through your nose. And when you breathe through your mouth, you do not. Right? Right. What else does neuroscience say? Well, there is a connection between breath and the way our cerebral spinal fluid flows. And this is inspiration is the major regulator of human CSF flow from 2015. Dr. Drea Kulaszewski et al. They say the present results unambiguously identify inspiration, that's breathing in, not other kinds of inspiration, breathing in, inhaling, as the most important driving force of cerebral spinal fluid flow in humans. Inspiratory thoracic pressure, that's the feeling of inhaling, reduction is expected to directly modulate the hydrostatic pressure conditions for the low resistance, paravenous, venous, and lymphatic clearance routes of the CSF. Isn't that great? So basically what's that's saying is that your cerebral spinal fluid is on a breath-powered pump. And you can see in both of these GIFs how much it's actually moving and how this whole movement is powered right here by what's happening right above your nose in the pituitary mucosa. Interesting.
So you're saying the brain is directly influenced by the nose, but not so much by the mouth? Is that what I'm getting?
Yes. But it's also influenced by other things. One of my favorite studies, this is one of my favorite studies to come out in years and years and years, by Bethany E. Koch, Barbara L. Fredersen, and it's called Upward Spirals of the Heart, Autonomic Flexibility as Indexed by Vagal Tone, Reciprocally and Prospectively Predicts Positive Emotions and Social Connectedness. This is again, fantastic paper. Go read this paper if you have any interest in reading scientific papers, because it's gorgeous. And what they say is that research has linked vagal tone to numerous indices of psychological well-being, including trait-positive emotionality, prosocial behavior, sympathy, and decreased maladaptive coping. Individuals higher in vagal tone appear to be cheerful and kind and deal well with stress, and these tendencies manifest themselves from childhood onward. So what is the vagus nerve? The vagus nerve is the nerve, and vagus means wandering. So it wanders all over your body. And this is an illustration from Swedenborg's time. Was an illustration that he might have had of where it goes, but it primarily goes to the heart. And so when they're talking about this connection, they say that, this conversation that's happening between your brain and your heart is measurably and dramatically affecting your state of mind. And just like Swedenborg said. This is a very similar paper, not the same paper. The main mediator of controlled breathing exercises on the described health, mental health, and cognitive effects is the vagus nerve. We posit that specific respiration patterns serve as respiratory vagus nerve stimulation. The styles of respiration providing respiratory vagus nerve stimulation are controlled breathing techniques that slow and deepen respiration and extend expiration. That part is really important. And possibly those that put emphasis on relatively stronger diaphragmatic breathing. So the reason why I say that extended expiration thing is so important is because that's exactly what yogis say. And if you look at like Swedenborg, like I said, there's lots of different ways that he describes internal breathing happening. But and Swedenborg kind of gets himself into trouble because he discovers this stuff, doesn't have any cultural background really for it. It's not like, someone in India who wants to study pranayama can go to a yogi who's part of a long lineage of other yogis who have all been doing this. And so when you go to India, you tend to find, and when you go to the yoga, you tend to find techniques for breathing, which are closer to the techniques that contemporary neuroscientists say will improve your mental health. Swedenborg's way of doing this was to, he was trying to keep himself as close to death as possible without going over. And he would, take very fast, shallow breathing patterns. And so his main way of doing it was making his breath shallower and shallower and subtler and subtler. And we see what happens to Swedenborg. You know, he becomes a prophet in the end, but not after going through hell, quite literally. Like he hurts himself, and he comes out the other side and creates all, you know, has this massive body of work and does everything we know of him. So that was great. But when I'm talking to people, don't try to do exactly what Swedenborg does, because what happened to Swedenborg will happen to you. Like you will affect yourself negatively. So I keep this in there to say that, look, this connection between breath and spirit and consciousness, absolutely real. He was right about a lot. If you want to practice pranayama, practice yoga. Practice yoga, read Swedenborg, because yoga is a tradition that has had, you know, thousands of years of peer review. Essentially, it's had, you know, people passing down things that work and people warning against things that don't work. And so I think really you need both if you're going to study this, because just doing exactly what Swedenborg does will have exactly what Swedenborg had happened to him happen to you, and you don't want to do that. So we also know that we have an interoceptive sensory system, and if you look at Swedenborg's work on the senses, his way of describing the senses is that we have external senses and we have internal senses. And he describes the sense of interiority, the interoceptive sense, as another sensory system. But it doesn't have obvious sense organs. Like you can say, I have eyes, I have ears, so I associate, you know, certain types of perception with that. But there are organs for the interoceptive system. They're just very subtle and very internal, and they haven't been identified until very recently. And I mean, we won't go super into detail about this, but suffice it to say, you know, the important takeaway is that when you look inside into your body, when you focus on how's my stomach feeling, how fast is my heart going, how am I breathing, what does my back feel like, what do my joints feel like, you know, what's going on, you know, do I have a headache, all of those kind of internal perceptions of the body are neurologically linked to our internal perceptions of our mind. So, and the brain does this a lot of ways, where the abstract version of a thing and the physical thing will actually have the same underlying neurological patterns. For instance, if we were talking about the olfactory cortex and how the olfactory cortex is connected to our emotional regulation and our emotions and our feeling and empathy. And so we can say that when we become aware of the essence of something, you know, when you are like, oh, that's, you know, this person has kind of has a good or a bad kind of smell to them, that abstract essence and that physical essence are using the same neurons, because and you know, this is partially why humans don't have a very good sense of smell compared to other mammals, because a rat uses their olfactory cortex for smelling other rats. A human being uses their olfactory cortex for deciding what political persuasion someone they're talking to has. Interesting. And then I want to talk a little bit about synesthesia. This is just kind of a minor point, that if we want to access, in a very like kind of sensory neurological way, access what is the internal, I think synesthesia, if you are synesthetic, is one of the easiest ways to illustrate that. Because what's happening, do we have a chat? Yeah, I'm almost done. So what's happening is that you have different kinds of sensory inputs, and then the brain itself creates has feedback. And when you become aware of that internal feedback, you can have kind of another sense impression that's beyond the external sense impressions. And so some people will associate like a colors with numbers and letters is the most common one. But that's an internal perception, you know, in a very physical sense. And I think that's a really good way of illustrating how we can have kind of an internal spiritual awareness of an external physical event or text or whatever. So then, you know, the question comes up with, we have all of these kind of ideas, we have all of these concepts, how do we use them? And certainly, you know, there's the contemplative part of it. But for me, I'm an artist, so I'm really interested in how can we illustrate, how can we illustrate this interior perceptive part of the mind with color. So I want to leave you today with an expanded awareness of our own sensory vocabulary and the potential depth of what seems like mundane perceptive experience. Many artists have used the sense of interiority to access imagery, which opens up deeper levels of the mind, and this is something that all of us can teach ourselves to do. So I wanted to start with a couple like mandala images, because I think the mandala is the perfect interoceptive symbol, because I think it reflects this kind of spiral structure that Swedenborg and Descartes before him and modern neuroscientists to a certain degree put into the brain and how the brain works. I think the mandala is an interior illustration of the self. And so did Carl Jung. He says, my mandalas were cryptograms concerning the state of the self, which was presented to me anew each day. And I have more examples. The vision of the angelic hierarchy from Hildegard of Bingen.
Can you tell me who Carl? Oh, I thought you said Carl Jung, but you're saying Jung, aren't you?
Carl Jung?
Jung.
Am I saying it with an American accent? I'm sorry.
Jung. It is Jung.
Yeah.
Well, Australians say Jung anyway.
Yeah.
So we have these kind of internalized patterns, which I think are very much a way of mapping subjectivity and mapping the mind in an interior direction.
They could be tied to spirals, really, couldn't they?
Oh, of course, yeah. And the cymatic patternings, which is another tangent I could have gone off to, and I'm glad I didn't add, because we would have run out of time. And then I wanted to kind of put in some of my own work and different ways that I've experimented with visualizing kind of conceptual, subjective, embodied space. And so I got kind of deeper and deeper and deeper exploring this kind of proprioceptive, interoceptive anatomy.
Lovely colors, beautiful colors.
As a language for expressing consciousness, for expressing kind of the reality of being, this kind of phenomenological internal space. It's the left side of my brain and the right side of my brain making out. Again, so they get closer. And then you get internal, and so you get kind of the two hemispheres colliding. And then it becomes one, and now they're together. And then we're gonna zoom in. We're gonna zoom in even more. We're gonna zoom in even more. The flowery serpent. Their spirit friends around the Son of Heaven.
They're very fractal.
Yeah. Therefore, you have only to make the light circulate. That is the deepest and most wonderful secret. The light is easy to move, but difficult to fix. If it is allowed to go long enough in a circle, then it crystallizes itself. That is the natural spirit body. And that's from The Secret of the Golden Flower, which is a medieval Chinese Taoist manuscript. So here's a list of works cited. A bunch of super interesting things. If you go to the link to that paper that I sent, you can, I have even more things in the bibliography there. So there's lots of different places you can go with this. Thank you so much. That's all I have today. I hope I didn't go over too much, but if we have any questions, we can chat.
So where does Hieronymus Bosch fit in?
What's that?
Oh, what's happened to you?
Oh, we can hear you, Leo. That's fine. Where does Hieronymus Bosch fit in, was the question.
It's just the opposite to what she was talking about, really, because he was coming from the underworld.
Yeah. Well, all of that is inside us too.
But he was a beautiful painter anyway. Lovely.
I mean, that's partially why, like, I give that, you know, that warning. Don't do exactly what Swedenborg says, because you don't know what kind of spirit. It's like talking to strangers on the internet. You know, you don't know what kind of spirits are out there.
You gave a terrific talk. It's just wonderful, the research you've done. So thanks for all that. This is going to be, you know, it's going to be forever what you've spoken. This is going to be viewed in years and years to come. They're a real shock. So thanks.
Yeah, I did. I published this a couple of years ago. I published this in 2019, I think. And yeah, I've been giving this talk a bunch of times, and I initially wanted to like set up a whole ministry around it, and then I was like, you know, I don't know if there's like a place for that in the church. So I'm just going to keep talking about it and keep doing presentations, because it really does shift my concept of what Swedenborg was about, because it was always kind of presented to me as I grew up in the church. I'm a 7th generation Swedenborgian. And so it was always really fascinating to me, you know, looking into the details, into kind of the technical aspects of this, because Swedenborg was presented to me growing up in the church as this kind of person up on a pillar. And it's like, you don't read anything before 1745. You don't really pay attention to what he was coming out of. And that's, you know, my current research, because this is something that I will continue talking about because I think it's so important. But my current research that I'm in right now, I'm talking about the Great Northern War and the kind of the situation that Swedenborg was in regards to his relationship with King Charles XII, who was this kind of absolutist autocrat dictator who basically destroyed Sweden during Swedenborg's childhood. And Swedenborg got recruited as his main military engineer, and so his whole childhood was spent, or you know, his whole kind of, you know, intellectual upbringing was spent in the midst of this collapsing empire, getting, you know, being ruled by this insane strongman. And so how much of Swedenborg's writings can we legitimately interpret as distinctly and, you know, emphatically anti-authoritarian?
And trauma.
Yeah, and trauma, exactly.
Was that Russia he was fighting it?
It was an alliance of the Russians, the Danes, the Poles, and the Germans. So
they haven't stopped, really, have they?
No, it's really, it's kind of sad, because I'm reading all of this stuff, and it was like, oh yeah, starting land wars in Asia is a really bad idea. like we're still haven't learned this lesson like 300 years later.
We have
It's like,
not. No.
No, that's for sure.
don't invade Ukraine. Don't do it.
Your tattoos can't be just an artifact. There must be some spiritual correspondence to your tattoos. What
To my
are they?
tattoo? Oh yeah, I'm covered. Well, this one's a Swedenborg quote. It says, "Now it is permitted to intellectually enter the mysteries of faith." Right here.
All right. I like it.
I've got runes. Got a
Yeah,
whole bunch of
Yeah.
yeah. I've got a double Ouroboros on my arm. I have
of course.
no hope, no fear. Does anyone recognize these?
No.
So, can I give you
These
my interpretation of the Ouroboros?
Yeah. Okay.
Truth is in the family of inner truth.
Yeah.
And when it's written in Chinese, it's written, truth is in the family from the top to the bottom. Truth is in the family. And then from the bottom to the top on the other side of the script, it says the family of inner truth.
Yeah.
Yeah. So how's that? In the Chinese language,
Pictograms.
they're reversed, but they still talk about precisely the same thing,
Yeah.
but from a different perspective.
Well, there's a
Language, so that says something about the language.
right. So one of my favorite Swedenborg quotes is from the work on the brain. It's not from the theological writings, but it's in a perfect and perpetual spiral. The center is the edge, and the edge is the center, and that's the geometry that he sets up. Actually, the word is yantromechanics. Those are the yantromechanics that he sets up for how energy works in the brain. Is that you have a spiral. So log equals phi, right? So phi is the golden ratio.
Yeah.
And the curvature of that spiral is a perfect perpetual spiral. So it's phi,
Yeah.
right? And if log equals phi, and you have this structure that then extends infinitely in two directions, both outward and inward,
Yeah.
Swedenborg says you will reach a point where that inward point and that outer point become entangled, where there is no actual distance between center and edge. And that's the geometry at which consciousness works.
At which what works?
Consciousness.
Consciousness.
Yeah.
So consciousness is able to exist because it's engaging with this kind of non-local field.
So it's inside looking out or outside looking in.
Yeah. So it is an Ouroboros, because once you reach the external most, you're at the internal most. Once you reach the internal most, you're at the external most. And at any point, and the deciding, measuring point of all of this. So I say it's Schrödingerian. No, I really mean it's capital S Schrödingerian, where, it is the observer. The observer is the one that determines, the center point of the quantum field.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's no gaps.
That perceives the entire universe.
Yeah, it's everything. It's you.
It's like neither without
and isn't that great? It's everything.
This is just pure awareness.
Yeah.
And then the body, the manifestation, which is called consciousness, obliterates the state of pure awareness, and one believes that he's living or she's living in a world and has a name and a form and senses and all the rest of it. It's like when you're reading a book, you're looking at all the words, but the only thing that makes the word possible is the piece of white paper that it's printed on.
And the person reading it.
Which is pure awareness. And the words printed on pure awareness are consciousness, which is not the reality. The reality is the background, which is eternal, just immaculate awareness.
So if you go to the very first memorable relation in true Christian religion, he addresses this, and it's really interesting because he's addressing the same problem throughout the entirety of his career. And he goes and he finds this person sitting in a cave, and he has this argument with them that if you have a circle with an edge and a center, does the center define the edge, or does the edge define the center? And the person in the cave is like, well, the edge defines the center. And Swedenborg's like, no, the center defines the edge. Because what determines kind of the nature of this structure, you know, all else being the same, is the direction of the flow of the energy. So you know, in Swedenborg's universe, all energy is flowing from center to edge. And then we become consciousness in this edge state, but that's an illusion.
Yeah.
And so we have to get back through spiritual development to the awareness that, and we do that through, you know, the imperfect illusory construct of the mind, which sees everything, you know, oh, we're in the external world, we have to work to get to the spiritual world. And that's the Ouroboros. That's the cycle. Is, you know, we become trapped in this externalized illusion and use spirituality, which is itself an illusion, to get back to a reality that's actually, you know, beyond our individualized kind of proprial egoic, you know, animus.
Yeah.
And,
For the soldier on the ground, love and do whatever you feel like doing. Love,
yeah,
and do whatever you want to do.
well, and stay in the flow. You know, keep that light circulating, keep the flow going, keep the, you know, the flucti spiritis, which I love as a phrase, because some people look at these books on the brain, look at these books on the cerebrum, and they translate the phrase flucti spiritis as spirit juices.
Yeah.
Which is a mistranslation.
Yeah.
It's the flow of breath. It's the flow of, because he's very conscious that there's a connection between spirit and respiratio. He's being very intentional about his word choices. And so when he's talking about the flow of spirit, it's the current of respiration. And again, he's pre-Galvani. He's pre any concept of electricity. He's pre-Benjamin Franklin at this point, right? Like the idea that electricity is a thing does not exist to him. So what does he do? He calls it the flow of spirit.
Yeah.
And you know, and it's frustrating because people will read this and you know, and dismiss it. But it's like, no, structurally, thinking of an engineer, he's right about so much that we can learn from and then use in our own spiritual practices. And if you get bogged down by kind of making Swedenborg right about everything, which a lot of people love to do, and it's like, well, you know, he can't be wrong. It must be symbolic, you know. No, he is wrong. And if we admit what he's wrong about, then we can appreciate what he's right about.
Yeah.
And we educate ourselves to align the things that he's right about to things that other contemporary neuroscientists have actually studied in an organized way. And that will help kind of tie the whole history of spirituality, you know, into something that's directly relevant to our lived experience as modern people. But is also, you know, this isn't trying to bring spirituality, you know, down to science. It is saying that, you know, our perception makes these things different, but in reality, there's only reality. And I think that's the main takeaway, is that there is only reality. There's only the, you know, like, you know, your own internal perception. So you better get good at understanding how it works.
Yeah, well, he was wrong about why the Lord permitted Islam. He said, first of all, it appealed to the Arab mind first.
Yeah.
Secondly, he said because they believed that Jesus was the Son of God. That's what
Yeah.
Swedenborg said, and
Yeah.
it's not true.
And he has a, very progressive for his time. Admittedly, he was allowing pagans into heaven, at a time when that was completely, unheard of. But at the same time, he is, very, very much of the mind that there is something superior about Christianity. There's something superior, so it's complicated. But when I say Swedenborg was wrong, I mean that's an opinion one way or another. I'm saying things like he believed they didn't understand that birds migrated, so he believed that in the winter seabirds slept underneath the ice in the sea. It's just flat factually incorrect. And I know that there are some Swedenborgians who will make all of these excuses. And it really muddies the water for what he was right about, which is something really, really important.
Yeah.
I notice that he barely talks about the nervous system.
What's that?
He doesn't talk very much about the nervous system in any of his books.
Yes, he does. I highly recommend Arcana Celestia. The chapter in which the number 4140 is fantastic. Or better yet, just go to New Christian Bible Study and type in the brain. Arcana Celestia 4140 is one of my favorite passages. He says, I have been shown the nature of the heavenly form, and it was the churning circumvolutions in the human brain. And then he writes an entire chapter on the Arcana that basically starts there, just on the correspondence of the brain. It's absolutely gorgeous. Go read it.
Folks, I'm very conscious of the time. It's coming on close to 9:45 here in Melbourne. Eleanor, I want to say thank you. I could actually sit here probably and listen to a great deal more. It's absolutely fascinating what you've brought to us tonight. Very glad to have you here again, and perhaps we might get opportunity to listen to you same time next year. Who knows? That would be lovely.
Yeah, keep in touch.
But thanks again very much for what you've presented to us tonight. It's been absolutely fascinating. I will just say before we disappear, our speaker for next month is actually here with us this evening. It's Martin Pennington. He'll be talking about the 5 steps to success. That will be at our normal time of 7:30, and the date is Friday the 31st of May for that talk. So
I don't have to get up on the other side of the world.
No. We look forward to what you've got to say and share with us, Martin, next week.
Thanks,
month.
David.
So,
thanks, Eleanor.
But thanks again, Eleanor, for what you shared. It's been absolutely fascinating.
And great. Thanks a lot. Really good. Thank you.
I'm really
enjoy
glad
the rest of your day.
Don't forget to revisit Hieronymous Bosch. Oh, love him.
And, if anyone wants links to my paper, feel free to email me.
I'd say, Eleanor, anything you want to sort of put out there, if you email it to me, I can pop it in the description for the video that goes up on YouTube as well.
All right.
That'd be cool.
Great. Wonderful. Well, let me know when it's up on YouTube. And I guess I'll hopefully see you guys next year.